Hello, this is a improvement on testing Hello World to introduce the idea of try with resources, which is a important concept in Java. A lot of what makes Java important in software is its safety, and the language has a lot of features to help you create code that tends to run correctly more often than maybe other languages, which is why it's important and used for a lot of what's called sort of enterprise scale software. Um, so I'd like to introduce some of that early on, and discuss the importance of being careful about writing code that's correct even when things break. So I'm starting here with the previous hello world essentially. So here's the run program that prints out the message hello world, and we had tested the hello world this way, which it goes a lot further than most people's hello world to go ahead and actually verify that our hello world produces what we wanted, but I'll still say we can do better than this. So what I'd like to point out is uh, programs don't always finish the way you expect them to, so things can go wrong, and so things might fail at unexpected moments. So let's go ahead and pretend that happens by just, well, actually, perhaps the easiest thing to do is in our test we're expecting hello world. So what if we forgot to put the exclamation point at the end of the message? So even though we're expecting hello world with a bang at the end there, we forgot to put that in, and so this is going to fail our test. And I'll run that, and we'll get what I've mentioned before is an exception. Um, so an exception happened. So what happened? So when this test run was set up, just following through the execution of this application, this test run was attempted, which means this happened, um, and a file was created called run.out with hello world in it as a message, and then that file was closed. Nothing went wrong there. But at the verify stage, right, when we're trying to validate that the contents of this file is actually what was generated by the run program, that didn't work out. And instead of just all green lights coming through, we get this exception. And what happened then is, instead of following through the normal, like this, then that steps of the program execution, when run was executed, an exception was thrown, and that's this what's called a stack trace. This is this trace of all the methods that were invoked until something exceptional happened, an exception. And so it never really got to this out close, is the important thing to point out. So I opened up a resource, this file, in order to do a check against in here, and it never really gets to the close, because instead of closing, it just created an exception. So that happens a lot, not just certainly in tests where you're having things go or not go right, and you're trying to make things work, so tests fail all the time. But in the regular execution of programs, it is quite common to have certain kinds of failures, especially with files. There's I/O errors and network drops and things like that that all create certain sorts of exceptional conditions. And so it's an important problem to have software that accounts for those kinds of exceptions. So I want to up our game a little bit and do a better version of this. Create a resource here, use it, and then clean up after yourself. Well, that's all right if everything between here and here works out, but it doesn't have to. And so what do you do in case it doesn't? So try blocks help you do that. And in this case, this is called a try with resources. And it looks like that. So what did I just change? So notice I'm still asking to create a resource, this thing that verifies against this output file. But now this method here returns a resource that's called a closable resource. So close out equals, so this keeps track of this closable resource inside of this little try block. Again, try with resources. And what happens with these special try blocks that Java has is if you are doing things, in this case we're just invoking this run method, once you exit the block, that is once you get out of this curly bracket matching that curly bracket there, then whichever resources you had requested, in this case this verify stream, the try with resources guarantees that you will actually close that resource, so effectively the out close happens even if something goes wrong. So in this case, so if I run it again, really can't tell that there's any difference. It didn't change the output because something broke, but I know that even though this broke when it invoked this method because there was an error in it, by the time it gets out of this try block, that is by the time it gets out to printing these sorts of messages, it in fact did close that resource. So that's a much safer way to do that. It is a little bit more typing than the out open out close version, but it is a much safer mechanism for allocating a resource and then when you're finished closing it off. So Java has a number of what are called closable or auto-closable resources, and I think an important modern way of allocating and deallocating those sorts of resources is to use this notation. So even though nothing goes wrong when we create at this moment, unless we have some sort of surprising disk error or something like that, we could also do the same up here and wrap this in a try block, and it would be, I'll say, a much better version. We can reuse that out name because we only use it inside of this little block anyways. So I create this output file called run.out, use it. Once I exit out here, I'm guaranteed that it's closed. So I know that that's going to actually close the file. And then down here, I actually verify against it. So that's an illustration, again, of what's called try with resources. And it's a much better way of opening and closing files where things are, I guess, reasonably likely to have some sort of problem. Okay, so the next upgrade that I'd like to point out is we don't actually need to create these temporary files. There is a shorthand KISS way. When you have a very short little message like this hello world that you're trying to verify against, instead of having to create a file that's a temporary file on a disk, for example, and then having to reopen that to validate it, there's just out expect. And expect, instead of a file name, just expects basically the list of things that you're expecting. So in our case, hello world bang, and then to be matching the ln part of things, I suppose the smart thing to do is put an end of line right there. So we're expecting to see that kind of output from this, and it will, again, it will be wrong, right, because we're expecting this exclamation point and we're not sending it out. But this is a try with resources, and now this little upper area request is actually unnecessary because this is done all as internal files that aren't saved to disk. It's just inside of the RAM memory of the computer that this data is set up, and then as the prints happen, it checks against that data to make sure that what's being generated down here matches. And of course, we still haven't fixed it, so we still should be seeing the same error. So there's still some kind of error in there. But now if I fix my output so it matches what I expect there, now we're back to it just running. And this little try block that created that file is unnecessary. It just happens internally. There's like an in Java process. So while the program is running, a little memory only file is created that has that information in it. It's used to check it. And because it's now in this try with resources block, it is guaranteed to close it off even if something goes wrong in that check. I won't leave any lingering bits around that waste memory in this case. So that's a better way of doing the hello world test. It's so this is called a try with resources. This is how you will be able to create resources that are guaranteed to be closed off at the end of the block. So here at the beginning of the block, I have a resource, then that block is executed, which in this case invokes this little run method. The run method runs with that resource available, so things that are generated in this case are being verified against what is expected to see. And then once this run method is finished with the test, those resources are cleaned off, and then finally down here, right, here's the test run being executed. The fact that it completed meant that there was nothing wrong with the test, and then after that the run method by itself is executed, which is why we get our little hello world. Now again, tested, and I'll say tested well with a nice clean try with resources and an out expect.